Good day everyone, how are you doing? This is Grandmaster David Bear says, I wish you happy Valentine's Day. Hopefully your celebrations is gonna include watching this video because isn't chess the most romantic game? Come on, the queen is doing its best to protect the king from move 1, of course. But on a serious note, why are we here? Well, this past weekend I competed in the Hungarian team championship on a Saturday from 10 a.m. where I faced a very strong opposition here. So as you see, my rating is 24-46, but my opposition had 26-15, which is a pretty significant deficit, nearly 170, right? If my math is correct. But before I jump into the game, how does a team competition in Hungary look like, right? As you see, there are 10 teams competing, and every once on Sunday per month there's one game, and where each team competes against the other. And as you see, one team consists of 12 players, right? And you're gonna be paired up with one player, and of course the result can be either draw, white wins, or black wins, and the individual points are added up, and then you get the final points of the two teams, right? And obviously I hope for a weaker opponent, but I got a much stronger one from France. He traveled all the way from France to face me. Come on, this is that's the man. So let's jump into the game, right? I hope you're also very excited to see. So my opponent started off with one e4, right? This is the most principled move, immediately trying to fight for the center. e4, d4, d4, d5, and e5. And since my opponent was from France, I thought maybe it would be very respecting to play the so-called French defense, right? And this is a very old line that roots back to the 1800s. And the whole idea is that I'm trying to fight for the center, and if white captures, I don't want to bring my queen into the game in the very early stage, but I want to recapture with the pawn, fighting for the center in the future, right? Because if I have to take with the queen, then I will no longer have a pawn in the center, and that's not really good for black. So normally what white does here, play d4, and black plays d5, and there are a lot of lines with knight c3, knight d2. White can capture on d5 right away. He can play the advanced variation on e5, the law of theory. I'm not gonna bore you with that. And now my opponent decided to get me out of my maybe preparation or comfort zone, and played queen to e2. I guess he had a long flight, so he didn't want to prepare too much. And yeah, this is not really a very common move. And if you are just learning the principles of chess, well, you might shout at my opponent that like, hey bro, what did you do? You shouldn't bring the queen into the game at such an early stage. Well, of course it has its own advantages, right, and tricks. The main trick is that if you play d5, which would be a logical response, white captures, and as you see, all of a sudden there is a pin on the e file, and no longer black can take with the pawn. I must take with the queen, but then knight c3 comes to the tempo, and that's not something black wants. Of course, in return, the queen is slightly misplaced on e2, blocking the bishop. But what happens when the queen retreats, and white can develop and fianchetto his bishop here on this diagonal, and actually that looks decent for white. So queen e2 is tricky, makes a little bit of sense, but if black knows what he's doing, he's gonna be aware of this trick. So what I did was knight to c6, immediately trying to gain control over one of the center squares, notably d4 in this case, and maybe I want to play knight d4 at some point, creating a double attack here. So he went knight f3, preventing knight d4 and probably preparing d4. And again, if you just learned your principles, I'm really sorry to disappoint you, but I played pawn to e5. And yeah, I just moved my pawn twice in the first 3 moves. That's not logical, right? But what's the point? Finally, white cannot push d4 because I'm just gonna grab the pawn, right? So basically, I lost the tempo, but I'm fighting for the center, and I forced the queen to e2, blocking his bishop, because normally in this case, it would be the Spanish line with the queen on d1, and white would play bishop either to c4 or b5 as a potential developing move. But unfortunately, if white wants to achieve that somewhere, but come on, you cannot play queen d1, because now actually black is the one who has won a tempo. So what happened here, white played c3, obviously preparing d4, and yeah, fighting for the center again, which I cannot comfortably prevent. So I play knight f6. Again, if you are just learning chess, my advice is that you develop the knights towards the center, right? You develop your bishop and try to castle ASAP. Push the king pawn, and yeah, just put your king into safety, and at least you will not get checkmated in 10 moves. That's pretty much great achievement, I guess, in the beginning. So finally, white played d4. I have to be honest, it was still a little bit of theory, although I looked at this maybe years ago. So I tried to recall and during the game. And one thing I have to add here, that both of the players initially have 1 hour and 30 minutes with a 30 seconds increment after each move. And after move 40, you get extra 30 minutes. So you basically have 90 minutes for the first 40 moves to make, right? And you have to decide how you deal with your time management. You can spend all your time in the beginning, but then you're gonna struggle in the last 30 moves, or you can always just dedicate 5-10 minutes to each move. And yeah, that's why it's good to know the theory, because usually theoretical lines go into the first 10 to 15 moves, and if you can play that fast, then you're still gonna have like about an hour for the remaining 25-30 moves, which is great. So yeah, so I played d4, finally forcing me to do something, right? And black has options here. If I want to maintain the center, I would play d6 here, right? Because if white capture, I can recapture the pawn and looks fine. The queen is still misplaced, so black is happy. But here, unfortunately, white can push d5 and challenge the knight on c6. Unfortunately for black, now I have to move my knight somewhere, not too active. Of course, you cannot move to a5, which would the only move forward, because then after b4, the knight will be trapped, and black is losing a knight for basically nothing. So I have to retreat backwards, which is not something I personally like to do. So I captured on d4, right? This is a very counterintuitive move, because it feels like you are just helping white, because look at now this great dominance in the center. Feels like white has achieved everything he wanted in the opening, right? Because he got this pawn on e4, pawns on e4 and d4. All black has knight on f6 and c6, and suddenly e5 and d5 could be a threat. But luckily, black has a way to develop really fast. What do you think? You can stop the video and try to think of black's next few moves. So I play bishop b4 check, that comes to the tempo. So what you have to observe is that finally I was able to get rid of the c2 pawn, so c3 that is not a threat anymore. Normally you don't want to give this bishop b4 check as long as the white pawn c2, because after c3 black would have the bishop have to retreat, and that's again would lose the tempo. But in this case, white can only block the check with an equally valuable piece, either the bishop or the knight. So of course, knight c3 very logical, still trying to maintain the structure in the center. And now I was able to finally castle. Big relief, right? Finally my king is not exposed in the file, and actually now it's white's king, right? look at this exposure here. All of a sudden looks very dangerous, and this e5 is not a threat anymore, because even if white captures in f6 after rook e8, the queen might get into trouble, right? So now white will deal with his development here, and he followed what I did basically, but on the other side of the board he pinned my knight so that I cannot take on e4. There is one trick. If white wanted to immediately get rid of this pin, black could take. And how could I utilize this pin? You can try to guess the tactic. Stop the video. And knight takes e4, queen takes, rook e8. And now the only way white can stop it with is knight e5, but then there is d6, and black is fine here, right? And I'm gonna regain the piece after d takes e5, and maybe the position is gonna be nearly equal, but yeah, it looks kind of dangerous. Yeah, so a3 would not make sense. So white very fast to counterpin my knight as well, and preparing something that he did in the game. So I played a6, immediately challenging the bishop. Now this bishop has no choice other than taking on f6, because if you move the bishop somewhere else back, then the e4 pawn is going to become a target again. So he took on f6, queen takes, and long castle. That's the spirit, my man. I was really surprised here, because as you see, the king usually wants to castle to the king side, right, when you have 3 pawns guarding them. Here you only have 2 pawns guarding the king, so it's slightly more vulnerable, right, because the c2 pawn is missing. And also this allows bishop takes, pawn takes, and as you see, then there's going to be a couple of weaknesses here. But my opponent is pretty tactical and likes sharp double-edged play, so I was up for the challenge. So now black has to be a little bit careful, of course. If you just want to develop with your bishop, all of a sudden, as you see, after castling, white got rid of the pin. Boom! A forky fork. Pretty scary. It's not losing material, but definitely not something black wants here. So you always have to be careful what your opponent does, right? Because one threat you had is not gonna be present every single move, right? So the condition is always changing chess. That's why it's super difficult sometimes. So what I did, I prevented this knight fork. I played the knight e7, queen to c4. Of course, it was pretty difficult for white to do something, because if you play e5, for instance, my black had a hidden idea with knight e7, which is queen to c6, pinning the knight. And now you see the lack of the pawn on c2 is pretty significant here, because if the pawn was on c2, this would not be a pin, and the knight could easily move. But now white is a pin, and slightly unpleasant for white. So he went ahead and played queen c4. Also, what white wants to do is immediately challenging the bishop, attacking the bishop, of course. And if I take, he might want to take with the queen and not with the pawn, which would weaken his king even further. So, okay, there are a couple of options here. I can take on c3 to give up the 2 bishops, but since I'm also not a conservative player, I played a5, and it's definitely double-edged, because normally you don't want to push a pawn, right? You want to develop your pieces. So, but what I wanted to do here is to force a3 and then take on c3, right? Because then at least I would create more weaknesses. So this is kind of like provoking white to play. Of course, he's a pretty strong player, so he didn't fall for it and play queen bishop d3, developing move. And now finally white has finished his development, and it feels like he's fine to go, right? Now black has to do something, because I set the bishop on c8, my rook on a8. Not very convenient. So I played pawn d6, immediately trying to bring my bishop out and finish my own development. King to b1, very prophylactic move, getting out of any checks here on this diagonal, and yeah, just general move. Pawn c6. So why did I play c6 is that there's always this knight e5 in the air. Whenever I move my knight, knight e5 was always a big threat, so I just wanted to get this done for the rest of the game. Queen b3. So the hidden idea of c6 was to sometimes either play d5 to create and like blow up the center, or maybe play b5 and trying to attack the king, because normally if you guys are you're castled opposite sides, it's much easier to attack on the other side, right? And you definitely don't want to attack where your king is placed, but on the other side where your opponent's king is castled. So b5 and maybe later a4 would make a lot of sense. So he played his cautious move, queen b3, bishop e6, attacking the queen, and he was trying to hide, right? Because on c4 it was pre-exposed, right? He was afraid that it might be trapped or stuff like that. Bishop takes. So the reason I took is that I was afraid that he might move the knight, and as you see after d6, my bishop actually has no way to retreat, and it could easily get trapped. So that's why I took on c3. I could have done other moves as well, but it was still fine. Queen takes, and finally my knight is maneuvering to the king side. As you see, we have trade of the dark color bishops. So my target is this f4 square, where I'm trying to put pressure on g2 and d3, and also undermine this knight on f3. To undermine the knight on f3, you have to attack this g2. So this makes sense. He played bishop c2, rook e8. These are all just prophylactic moves. Of course, you want to bring your pieces towards the center, and maybe on a good day I'll be able to create some tactics and put pressure on this e4 pawn. Maybe not. We'll see. h3, preventing potential bishop g4. That would pin the knight. So prophylactic. And finally, knight f4. My first active move since move 3. So a knight e1. A very controversial move. You usually don't want to move backwards, right? But the g2 pawn was hanging, and yeah, it wasn't an easy way to defend this pawn g2. And also he has a very sneaky idea, which I had to see, which was basically g3. And how does white want to strengthen his center? g3 and then f4, and then preparing e5 breakthrough, and that would be very, very dangerous for me. So I had to deal with it. But so what can you observe about this knight e1? Why is not looking very, very optimal here? Because he just removed the knight from the center, right? So if you manage to remove one defender from the center, what do you want to do? You want to create counterplay in the center, right? c5. It's a pretty okay move. Obviously, I need to create counterplay here, right? I want to open the c file, maybe take here, bring my rook over, and yeah. He played queen to e3. The reason being is that if he captures, I have this intermezzo move, right? I take on c3, pawn takes, and now I take on c5, and all of a sudden after b takes c3, what happened is that he got this one island into two pawn islands, and in any kind of endgames you don't really want to have that, because if they don't have adjacent pawns, they are considered to be weaknesses here, right? So all of a sudden with this one move, white has weaknesses, and that's put him in a worse position, I would say. So he played queen e3. I took on d4, rook takes d4, and now rook c8. As mentioned, I need to create activity here, because I know in the center white has g3 f4, so I need to do something. g3 happens, knight g6, f4, and this makes a lot of sense because my knight is actually pretty restricted here. I cannot go here, cannot go here. I mean, you don't want to go to h8, you don't want to go to f8. And also this d6 pawn is a weakness. Can you guess why rook takes d6 was not working? And you guessed it correctly. Bishop takes a2. Beautiful discovery move. King takes, and I pick up the rook. and now black is up material. Rook pawn versus the bishop, but of course the rook is much more valuable. So this doesn't work. Unfortunately, my opponent didn't go for it. F4. What I did was knight e7. What do you think? What's my plan with knight e7? For example, if white plays knight f3, which would be very, very logical, right? After f4, you might want to bring the knight towards the center, maybe preparing e5, maybe f5, g4, and also you want to give extra support to the rook by the knight, so then your queen is going to be more flexible moving around the board. What do you think? Does black have any tactic here or not? I don't know. Yes, black does have knight to f5, creating a fork. And you would argue that maybe there was a mouse slip, but it's not, because if you take bishop a2, king takes, and I pick up the queen, and we all know that if you take the queen and you keep your own queen, you're probably better off. So, and black is of course winning. So it's a nice little tactics that was involved here, but of course in this level it's not easy to use it. So he went, so he played queen to d2. He got out of this e file and put extra pressure on d6. So this seems to be falling, right? What can I do here? If I push d5, he's gonna take it again because he's attacking with 3 pieces. If I protect, I could protect with d8, but that would be very passive. And sometimes you have to let the pawns go, right? This is life. So what to do? How can I create counterplay? Knight to c6, right? I was like, okay, the d6 is gonna fall anyways. I need to attack the king. Knight b4, putting pressure on the c2 bishop. I mean, I played rook c8 for a reason. And also I'm threatening with bishop a2 now. So he played a very logical move a3. Didn't want to give out the pawn on a2 and challenging my knight. As you see, if I take, he can take with the knight, nothing special. So I decided that it's time to create some crazy tactics here, or crazy counterplay. And also, I think we're under 10 minutes here. And as you see, it's still move 26. So there was 14 moves until the next time control. And if you're below 10 minutes, then things are gonna heat up, right? So I played rook to d8, very innocent move, seemingly, right? But what I want to do is, as I showed you earlier, I have this nice pin here, which I'm using as a discovery, right? So I have this bishop a2 in the air, but the queen was protecting the rook. So what I'm doing is I'm attacking the rook, right? If he takes my knight, I'm gonna take the rook. If he recaptures, I have this bishop a2 trick still, and I'm gonna pick up the queen. And if he takes the rook, I take with the rook, attacking the queen, and I'm still not losing the knight. So that's a trick. So he went and played very logical e5, protecting his rook and attacking my queen at the same time. So it feels like I'm losing some material, because if I move the queen back, then finally he can pick up my knight, because the rook is protected by the pawn and the queen, and I'm running out of tricks, right? But I had this move, rook takes d6, queen takes d6. So if he recaptures the pawn, finally I'm out of this threat of e takes f6, right? So queen takes d6 made a lot of sense. I played bishop a2 check, king a1, queen takes d6. I had to take on d6 because both my queens and the knights are hanging. Take. And now it's a very, very tricky position, because as you see, if you count the pawns, black is a pawn down, and also my knight is hanging. If I move my knight, bishop, right? So it feels like black is lost, or probably worse. Of course, the bishop is hanging as well, but this deep d6 pawn is only 2 squares away from being promoted, and you don't want that, right? So what did I do here? I moved my bishop out from a2 and created a sneaky threat, attacking the rook. and at the same time the bishop is still hanging, apparently, or apparently not. So also, as you see, the king, I forced the king to the corner on a1, and since the a2 square is basically covered now by two of my pieces, there's always this back rank checkmating threat, so white has to be kind of careful. And now my opponent was down a few minutes, of course I was as well, and he played a very logical rook to h2. So what he did was rook from h1 where it was hanging, and the bishop on c2 at the same time. Very logical. And now my knight is hanging, right? It's very, very difficult to move, because if I bring it back, then I'm just a pawn down. I have nothing compensation. If I take the bishop, he's gonna recapture with the rook, and again I'm gonna have a hard time picking up this pawn. Maybe I can be rook d8, but it's not ideal. And also, if you consider it was mutual time trouble here already at move 31, we still needed to make 9-10 moves. And when you're in time trouble, you always try to create problems for your opponent. So I played rook to e8. Was the drill here, right? So the threat is I want to take on e1, right? Creating this mating pattern on the back rank. And so if he goes d7, I'm gonna take the knight. He has bishop to b1, and now I can catch the pawn with my knight, bring back to c6. So now white do something, and the time was ticking. He had a few seconds here, and took my knight. Obviously, it's already not the best move according to the engine, but okay, we are not engines, right? We are humans, so I'm trying to play it like a human. So a takes b4. I took his knight. As you see, the king cannot come up because I'm covering by the bishop. So only move is bishop to b1, and boom, bishop e4. Oh my god, did I just win the piece? Wow, right? Because if he plays d7, I take the bishop with a check tempo, right? King a2, and it feels like the pawn is impossible to catch, but I have rook to d1 and the game is over. So because d8 I just pick up and I'm up a piece. So I was like, okay, wait, what? He's 26-15, super grandmaster, and missed this? Of course not, because he went rook to d2. Very nice move, right? He doesn't care about the bishop, but what he does, using this basic endgame technique, if you have the advanced pawn or a passed pawn, you want to give support from behind, right? With the rook. If you go behind, the rook, my rook is unable to pick it up from d1. So now actually it's very tricky, because if I take with the rook, he goes king a2, and all of a sudden d7 is unstoppable. I cannot stop with the rook. If you move back, d7, and it's just gonna march. If you try to play bishop to f5, he plays d7, you take, and I'm not gonna take the bishop but the rook, and all of a sudden I'm exchanged down, right? Exchange means the rook versus bishop. Rook is more valuable than the bishop, of course. And now suddenly black is lost, or close to be lost. So black has to be careful actually. So what I did, I took with the bishop, right? I created this pin here, this discovery, d7, and I played bishop f5, check, and at the same time attacking the pawn on d7. So even though I'm a piece up, definitely I'm forced to give the bishop back for the pawn. King to a2, and of course I could take on d7 and rook takes, but it feels like a little bit unpleasant endgame, rook endgame for black, because the rook is very active and the king can come up, and my king is very far from his pawns here on the queen side, so it's tricky. So I played this very strong move, bishop a6, bishop e6, check, forcing pawn to b3, right? If you go normally in an endgame, you want to activate your king, but you gotta be careful, Mr. Rook a1 checkmate, right? So He played b3, and now I took on d7. Rook takes d7, and I took the pawn. So the whole idea of this bishop e6 intermezzo check was I forced the pawn to b3. As you notice, if the pawn was on b2, he come up with the king to b3 and take my pawn and activate the king. And you will see the major difference is that after b3 I was able to give a check, and now the a6 a3 square is covered by my pawn, so he cannot actually march up. So he had to go back to b1. Finally I cut the king off, right? Basic principle, especially in rook endgame, you should try to cut your king from being more active. In this case, being more active is to basically come up with here. So I played rook to e3. As you see, my pawn on b4 is hanging, right? So it's equal pawn, 4 pawns endgame. I could defend my pawn, but this would allow now the king to come to c2, then king d3, kicking out my rook, and this pawn is actually going to become a huge weakness. Long term, white can probably win the pawn. So what I have to do here is to create counterplay. I'm letting this pawn go. Goodbye. See you next game. And I play rook e3, creating a double attack. This way, that way, right? So white captured my pawn, I captured his pawn. And now it's gonna become a competition, right? It's a big race here, as you see, because I have the pawn majority on the king side, 3 versus 2. He has the pawn majority on the queen side, just the b3 pawn itself. And yeah, it's pretty difficult. But as you notice here, is move 41, so we both received extra 30 minutes. But there's no more time control, so if you run out of 30 minutes, it's gonna be stressful, yeah? Because all you're gonna have is a 30-second increment after each move, which is not much. So yeah, this is actually very, very interesting rook endgame, because all you have to do here is to calculate. And at this point, we had been playing for nearly 4 hours. Imagine that, 4 hours or into the game, eating one sandwich, drinking 1 liter of water, and not breathing any fresh air, stuff, right? So, but this is chess, very romantic sport. So he played h4, sorry. He tried to save his pawn as long as possible, right? So I went after the pawn. He plays f5, right? Horizontally protecting the pawn h4. Obviously, the reason he doesn't want to give up as easily this h4 pawn, because if I take, then I'm gonna have 3 versus 1, and black would actually have a pawn up, and still would be a race, but a much easier race compared to this scenario. So rook f3, right? I no longer can attack this h4, so I'm trying to catch this f5. As you see, they are not connected, so they are both considered weaknesses, right? So because they cannot defend each other. So rook f3. He played rook f5, and the thing is that at some point it's time to bring the king into the game, right? Again, if you are learning endgames, you know that the king is very important. We finally got rid of the queens and 1 pair of rooks and all the bishops and knights, so the king is fairly safe to bring it to the middle of the board. Usually you don't want to do that while all the pieces on the board, because kind of likely to get checkmated, right? But queens are off the board, so it's not as dangerous anymore. So king to f8. White does the same, trying to copy. King to e7. b4. It's time to push, right? King f6. Logically, king to d6 would make sense, because the king would then catch the b4 pawn, easy, right? But I'm actually having something else in mind. King f6, I'm attacking the pawn. Rook a5. Of course, in order to push the pawn, you have to slide the rook over. And now I took on f5. Could be seemingly a very controversial move, because like, hey bro, what are you doing? I mean, he just captures and promotes the pawn, and it seems like he's faster. But is he faster? b5, king e6, b6, king e6, b7, king 7. Hallelujah! I catch the pawn, and now it's over, right? Because I have 3 versus 1. So again, endgame, you have to do a lot of calculations, right? So usually pawn endgames are really tricky, but in this case it wasn't super difficult math. So I took, and he played king c3. Very tricky, right? If I try to use the same technique, taking here would be a big mistake, because after b takes a5, as you see, now the pawn is not on the b file, but one file further, right? And now, if you try to catch, it's gonna be a difficult game, because I cannot teleport my king here, unfortunately, since it's not a knight. King c7, and then white just promotes and wins the game. So you really gotta be careful, because maybe one technique works in one position, but again, conditions are changing. So I played g5. I was aware that if he takes on f5, the king from f5 can catch the pawn. And since I have 3 versus 1, then if I able to bring my king in front of the pawn, the two connected pawns are gonna beat the king, and the king is going to have to come for the pawns to catch them, and I'm just gonna take the pawn, and the connected pawns here are gonna win easily. So he went and gave a check. Very logical, right? Because now after g5 I created a weakness on h6, so I was forced to go back to defend the pawn. Pawn takes, king c4, check, king c5. Okay, these moves are made to gain some time. Now I finally push as well. As you see, it's a huge race. Even though I have 2 pawns here on this side, he has 1 pawn here, but he's short of the king. And at the same time, unfortunately, my king is cut from moving towards to support, right? So this double-edged. In these cases, quality takes over quantity, right? So again, a lot of math is done here. I gave another check. You know, as long as you give checks, cannot be that bad, right? King c5, and I played rook to f1. One thing I noticed here is that you have to go behind the pawn, right? As you see, if white was able to bring the rook here and push the pawn, that will create much more chances for this pawn to be promoted. So what I'm doing here is I'm going behind the pawn myself, because from behind you can put the most pressure. So b6, rook b1. So what I'm doing here, I'm trying to settle this pawn, and then after my rook is perfectly placed, then I'm gonna push my pawns and hope for the best, right? King c6, of course he needs to give support. Finally I push my pawn. Pawn b7, check, king here, rook b1, king c7, and now as you notice it's move 60. So it's been 20 moves since we received the 30 minutes, and again what happened was a very difficult, time-consuming endgame. So we are again down into minutes or seconds here at this stage, and the game had been played for 4.5 hours now. So pretty tough, huh? And what is the threat here is basically white wants to play rook to b6, cutting my rook off. So I was really panicking. I sacrificed my rook. It was like, you could say like, what? Why would you do this? The rook is more valuable than the pawn, right? We'll see. Pawn g3. And it feels like, well, black could also lose, also win, maybe draw. We're both down to seconds again. King c6. Very logical, right? What the king wants to go and catch these guys, and the game would be over, right? But it turned out this was the ultimate mistake. Pawn g2. Only way to catch it is rook a1. f4. Attacking the pawn makes sense. And just on time f3. But the king is coming. Oh my god, king e4, king f3. Black might lose it. But there is a last twist here. What's the most logical move? f2, right? Rook takes g2. Check. And now the rook arrives as a party blooper and wins the game. So still gotta be really careful. So I play king f6, king e, and yeah, rook a1 happened. If he was king e4, I'm just on time to promote the pawn here, and this is a theoretical win. So he played for some rook a1 at, I don't know, 3 seconds, very panicky move, f2, rook a6 check, and he resigned because he realized that there are no ways to give any kind of perpetual checks, like king f5 and no more checks, and I'm promoting one of them or both pawns, and the game is over. So yeah, that was a tough game, very long, 5.5 hours, so I need a few days to shake it off. But I hope you liked the video, you learned something. A little bit long video, but yeah, and happy remaining Valentine's Day. Thank you for tuning in, and hope to see you soon in my next videos. Have a great day, guys. Bye bye.